Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to Fire Authority meeting Friday the 17th of December at 10:30 AM on the dot. Before anybody remarks, I have taken off my mask. Thank you to everybody who's here in the meeting today, both members present and officers who are wearing a mask. Just given the situation with COVID, in particular with the Omicron variant, we are as socially distanced as possible in the room, and there are only the people really who are required to be here today in terms of elected members and officers. If when you're speaking in the meeting you do wish to take your mask off, then I'm absolutely fine with that. I know it can be very difficult to be heard and to project your voice through masks, but if when you're not speaking you could wear your mask, that would be most appreciated.
Chair, can I just make a point on that we had cross-party consensus to move meetings online at the height of the first round of the pandemic. And as I understand it, the regulations lasted for a year and then lapsed. It is ridiculous when we're asking people to work from home that the government haven't allowed this to happen, to go back to online meetings at the height of another wave. So I wonder whether it would be appropriate for the authority just to make that point at some point through back channels or, through a letter to central government, because the more people that do, the message might get through.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Battlemuch. I think you make a really good point, which I suspect is a point shared by people across the meeting here as authority members. I have continued to press the case through the Local Government Association. I know the colleagues in the room, cross-party here, have done that. I know colleagues in the room have had conversations with the Chief Executive of the County Council, who's led on a number of these issues with government and has pressed the case with civil servants. And at the moment, for whatever reason, and I'm not going to draw a conclusion about what the reason is, there seems either a reluctance or not the bandwidth to reinstigate the regulations that allow us to be online. But I think the point you make, and I'll echo it again here publicly, is right, that given the issue we have with this particular variant at the moment, we're asking our staff to work from home, it would be wise, I think, to put regulations back in place to allow formal meetings, the Fire Authority meetings, council meetings to take place online. Not just for ease or convenience for us as elected members, but as you said, Councillor Battlemuch, to make sure that actually we are protecting each other and that we're protecting our staff who we expect to do a difficult job. So I will certainly continue to press that case, and I know that the Chief Fire Officer has conversations with colleagues in the Home Office who obviously liaise with colleagues in the Secretary of State's Department, Michael Gove, I think the Department for Levelling Up in Communities it's now called, and I'm sure John will take the opportunity if he gets to reflect the views back of the authority on that point. Councillor Lee?
Chairman, thank you. Completely agree that if we need to have the meetings away from here, then we do so. I would just say that we need to make sure that members do have the ability to have their meetings. So hopefully planning will happen now just in case we do need to have their meetings, that every single person does have the ability. Because at the moment in time, my members are still not getting the agendas. We've got 2 people that aren't getting the agendas. And if that can't be arranged, then how can we expect that meetings away will be able to happen? So I would just say that planning needs to happen now just in case. But I appreciate that, Chairman. Thank you.
Point taken, Councillor Lee, and noted, and I understand your point about drawing a link between not receiving agendas and the meetings, but if there's an issue about agendas, we need to get on top of that irrespective. So
I did ask them,
so the point's taken, and we'll pick that up. And then you're not the only people that have faced issues with that, so we'll do whatever we can to try and resolve that issue. And I think the second point you made, John, about being prepared for the eventuality of moving to online meetings is well made and is noted as well. Anybody else? No? Okay, on to the formal business on the agenda. Item 1 is apologies for absence. I think we've received apologies from Commissioner Henry and also just for Councillor Scott Carlton as well, and it looks to me like everybody else here is present. Item 2, declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest by elected members or officers? John?
Yeah, just for candidate and I, paper 8 regarding principal officer pay. Candidate and I will leave the room while you're discussing that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other declarations of interest? No, not seeing any. Okay, item 3 on the agenda is the minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of September. 2021. Any comments or questions people want to raise in relation to the minutes? Not seeing any indication people are happy to approve them as a correct record. Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 4 is Chair's announcements. Let me just start with the incredibly sad news to hear of the passing of Councillor Maureen Dobson, County Councillor for the Collingham area and surrounds. Maureen was a really close friend of Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue and of many people on this authority here who either were close friends with her by virtue of knowing her as a county councillor or served alongside her on the county council. The service, the chief and the local crew, who I know had a very, very close relationship with Maureen, particularly after some really tragic incidents in Maureen's community where Maureen stepped up and stepped in, showed leadership in the community, working alongside the local crew, will be at the funeral next week, and both myself and the Chief Fire Officer issued a joint statement about the commitment that Maureen gave to the service. So our thoughts are with Maureen's family and her close friends and her colleagues who served alongside her. Really, really awful news. And anybody who knew Maureen, she was a real firebrand, unapologetic about standing up for her community, unapologetic about her views, but a genuinely lovely person who took a real interest and care and compassion in anybody that she worked alongside. So our thoughts with the family at this time and Maureen's friends as well. Just on COVID, we've obviously just touched on this issue. Staff are now working from home where they're able to do so. Additional restrictions have been put in place to mitigate risks. Face coverings to be worn, as I've already said, unless speaking, please. And to support the vaccination booster programme, 10 staff have been redeployed to the NHS for the next few weeks to support coordination and to administer vaccinations. And I just want to say, again, repeat on behalf of the entire authority, and we've said this here before in this meeting, a huge thank you to every single member of staff in the service who has stepped up, and particularly those staff who then, as a result of everybody's effort, been able to be freed up to administer those first and second vaccinations, and also now the booster vaccinations, which are an absolutely critical line of defence against particularly the Omicron variant that we face in the coming weeks and months. And I'd just like to say, Chair of the Fire Authority, on behalf, I'm sure, of the whole authority, that for anybody watching this meeting or listening to the meeting who hasn't had their booster jab, go and get your booster jab. There are ample amenities and facilities across the city and county where you can either just walk in or book an appointment online or through the phone service. Please do go and do that if you haven't done so already. And if you are one of the people who hasn't yet had your first or second vaccination, please, please, please take the opportunity to go and get those vaccinations as well. Just on HMIC FRS, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary for Fire and Rescue Services, the inspection of the service, which obviously we've talked about in here before, concluded in November. We're hopeful that they have seen improvement within the service. Our report is expected in May next year, so there's quite a considerable wait actually after the conclusion of the inspection, which I guess just demonstrates how rigorous and robust the inspection regime is. On Wednesday, the State of Fire report was laid in Parliament along with Tranche 1 service reports, and analysis will be presented to the Fire Authority in February. I will just say at this point, having read the State of Fire report, and I made this point before and I've made it on several occasions, deeply disappointed, I have to say, by and large, in reading the report by Sir Tom Windsor. I think yet again there is a loss of a sensible, genuine debate about issues facing the fire service and the fire sector and our communities who rely on the service because of Sir Tom Windsor allowing his own personal agenda and incendiary remarks in the report to get in the way. Frankly, I found it deeply offensive reading the report halfway through to see that there was a recommendation that was right to strike the firefighters should be removed. And I make no bones or apologies sitting here as Chair of the Fire Authority that I think that is misguided, I think it is misjudged, I think it is incoherent, and I've already said publicly, I think it is the wrong answer to the wrong question. There are stresses and strains in the fire service. There are issues that the fire service has to work through. Our colleagues who work on the front line understand that. Our trades unions understand that and aren't frightened to walk through and liaise in terms of those issues. But I think to throw incendiary issues onto the table that muddy the waters is deeply, deeply unhelpful to having a mature and sensible debate around some of these issues, and I think in some ways actually it undermines what otherwise may have been a good piece of work in terms of the state of fire report, but there'll be further presentation on the substance of those issues in February. Just in terms of joint headquarters, the building will be handed over to us by the end of the year, and staff will start to move to the new joint headquarters in January. This will be phased over a few months as refurbishment of existing buildings is undertaken. Fire Authority meetings will continue here, as we've said before, until after the annual general meeting, which I think will be in summer next year. A formal opening ceremony is being planned for next year, and members will be invited. And I know Sir John Peace is working really hard on that with us, as well as Lord Lieutenant, in terms of coordinating the opening ceremony, because I think it's a really important event for the wider local community and signals our close working between the fire service and the police. And then just two final issues. We held our awards ceremony recently, thanks to those members who came along. It was a really nice event at the Albert Hall. It was attended by the Lord Lieutenant, Sir John Peace. It was great to be back there after missing out last year because of COVID, and it was a superb opportunity to recognise the absolutely amazing work that our staff do on the front line, and not just our own staff actually. Really, really touching to see some of the amazing acts of heroism of members of the public, in particular the three members of the public there, I think, who not too far from Newark stepped up and stepped in when there was a really serious road traffic accident, and were recognised quite rightly in terms of the award by the Chief Fire Officer. But over and above then, the acts of bravery, you know, massive amount of effort in terms of raising money for charity on a number of our stations. The Chief Fire Officer was recognised for the amazing work that he's done in terms of the Firefighters charity over his tenure here at Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service, and I know he intends to continue to support that charity even when he steps down from his current role. So it was an absolutely brilliant event. It was really nice to see family members there alongside the people who work for us in the Fire and Rescue Service, because it was really clear on the evening that they couldn't do the work that they could do without their families supporting them. And then finally, it might not feel like it with all the doom and gloom news of COVID on the TV, but Christmas is just around the corner. So I just want to say a huge thank you, first and foremost, to every single member of staff who works for us for the amazing work over the last 18 months, not only keeping the show on the road, but also a sterling effort in terms of stepping up in the national effort to tackle COVID and protect our communities, and everything else they did, delivering food parcels, medication, clothing, helping people who were socially isolated, and raising money for charity. But just to finally say, sincerely from me as chair and on behalf of Toby as vice chair, a massive heartfelt thank you to every single member of the authority who I think have made a really, really valuable contribution this year to the debate. And I think the political consensus, the decent working relationships that we've found here in the room, including with the Commissioner, Caroline Henry, would not have been able to be achieved without everybody's effort in this room. I don't take any credit for that as chairman. It is a collective effort of all of us here. So whichever group you're from, whichever authority you're from, whichever area you represent, thank you for your contribution and valuable service on the Fire Authority. It's really appreciated, and let's look forward to an optimistic and better 2022 as we move forward. Any comments or questions in terms of Chair's announcements? No? Okay. Item 5, our first substantive item on the agenda, is the medium-term financial strategy 22-23 to 25-26 and budget guidelines for 22-23. And I think Becky is going to introduce this report.
Thanks, Chair. So, medium-term financial strategy, this is more of a scene-setting exercise on the current financial position of the authority and the economic position of the country at the moment, with a view of asking F&R Committee, Finance and Resources Committee, to undertake further scrutiny of a more detailed budget in January before bringing back recommendations for setting council tax levels at this authority in February. So the main areas in strategy for your recommending today are your reserve strategy, the capital strategy, and obviously setting out those criteria again for asking F&R Committee to review the more detailed budget in January. So you'll be aware from current news that we have quite a lot of pressures arising in the economy at the moment. Inflation's rate has risen quite highly, It was back when I wrote this report only just a couple of weeks ago. It was 4.2%. It's risen now to 5.1% in November. Further than that, gas and fuel inflation is up at nearly 30%, it's at 29%. That has a huge impact on some of our budgets. As you can imagine, fuel is something that we get through quite a lot of. So that alone would increase the pressure on our budgets by a couple of £100,000. And with CPI at 4.2, well now 5.1, that does affect people's budgets at home, obviously, as well, and it does have an impact on pay inflation. And pay is obviously our biggest driver of cost. It relates to about 80% of our budget. So for the purposes for the medium-term financial strategy, we've assumed a 3% pay award, which may or may not be delivered next year. So some of the scenario setting that I've done as part of the strategy does relate to around those pay awards, because a 1% pay difference for the authority is about a £330,000 difference. So I've set the most likely scenario at 3%. If it was up at 5%, you're looking at getting on for £700,000 worth of additional costs, which is a big pressure on our budgets. Other pressures that we have at the moment, obviously those inflation will feed through into some of the contracts that we've got. Certainly building contracts will be under additional pressure, cost pressure there. And also our gas is due up for renewal in the new year. So that will have quite a big impact when we have to negotiate new prices for that. We've got, again, as we've already discussed, the COVID Omicron variant is going to have an impact on the service, and we're already helping our partner organisations. We are expecting some funding towards a booster campaign where we're helping, but there are other areas we're being requested to assist with, and the funding for that is still to be determined. So that may impact on this year. Hopefully, once we get through the winter, that'll have less of a pressure on next year. Pensions, we have a new valuation of the Firefighter Scheme as of 2020. For those of you that were here back in about 2018, when we had the 2016 valuation, it resulted in an increase of employer costs, which was about £2.5 million for this authority. So it is quite a big risk area, and although that won't come through till budgets in 23-24, it's something we need to be watching quite closely, and does have a pressure down the line. We did receive an additional grant towards those costs of just over £2.2 million, but that's still less than £300 pressure, and that could be something that we could see again moving forward. The Treasury has withdrawn the immediate detriment guidance for the McLeod remedy, the age discrimination case against the fire pension scheme. So the policy and strategy did adopt the memorandum of understanding that had been agreed between the Local Government Association and the Fire Brigade Union. And we adopted that back in November, only just a month ago, but that was based on guidance that the Treasury had issued, which has now been withdrawn. So nationally, we're still reviewing where we sit on that, but I have made the decision just to continue with implementing the remedy through the Memorandum of Understanding, because legally we've been told we need to move forward in removing the discrimination case against our firefighters that have retired. So that does come with some risk in that there may be some costs relating to tax payments from the pension scheme that may be incurred, but I think that the risk there hasn't changed since we made the decision. So that moving forward may have some costs, but I don't think they will be significant. Moving on to funding settlement from yesterday, you may have been aware that it was just disappointing to see it was just a one-year funding settlement. We had hoped for 3 years to give us some financial certainty moving forward. That's not happened, but funding did come in largely in line with what we were expecting. It was generally, we've had some additional funding to help cover the 1.25% for national insurance contributions, although it doesn't cover the entire cost for us. It wasn't based on your actual cost, it was more proportioned as in the revenue support grant that we received from the government. But nonetheless, we've received some funding for that. There was an additional one-off services grant of just over 740,000, which I was anticipating that we would get something. So some of that has been already built into the figures that you've got in the medium-term financial strategy today. So all in all, I don't think although it may have changed slightly, it's not the figures before you that are still sort of hold strong in line for the funding settlement. So if I can move you to page 16 of the report. I looked at 3 cases: a worst case, a most likely case, and a best case scenario. And again, as I said earlier, most of the difference between that is the level of pay award. In the worst case, financially for the authority would be a 5% pay award. I've calculated the figures based on that. I said that local council tax support income is not continued, but I would imagine we will get some of that now, so it would not be quite such a position that you see there. That 2.3 million would be more like 1.8. That does assume that we will make £1 million worth of temporary savings within the budgets for next year, and we're working currently with SLT to finalise how we would do that, to give us a chance to move forward in the future, which I'll come on to in a minute. But the second box is the most likely scenario, which still looks at a deficit of around £800,000, and that's largely caused by pay inflation and the inflationary costs. It was only back in the summer that we did actually feel that we would be in a position where we may have got the £5 permission to look at increasing council tax should it be required, and inflation was still down at 2%, and at that point we thought we may be able to invest in our services. But clearly the inflation factor and that impact on salaries has made a big impact on the projections going forward. So you'll see from that table in 2.15 that the position can vary quite a lot depending on those. It's mostly the pay awards that would have an impact. So in light of the issues that we've got, that we're moving forward, I have looked at the reserves, the earmarked reserves, with particular scrutiny this year. This is something that we do every year as part of the reserve strategy, and I've gone through all the earmarked reserves and freed up where I can, where either the original activity has been delivered within budget, or there's surplus budget, or we've managed to fund it from within the revenue budget, meaning that those reserves are no longer required. And I've identified £1.9 million worth of reserves that would be available for reallocation. And with the community risk management plan that's now out for consultation, we would like to look at the opportunity to try and freeing up some funding to help us deliver those key priorities moving forward once it's been approved by Fire Authority, and also that would help us put us in a positive position should we need to make any efficiency savings in future years once we have a better understanding of what our funding will be from 23-24 onwards. So I'm proposing, as part of this budget, to use those £1.9 million of reserves. If you're on page 20, highlights the reserves that I've moved it from into a budget pressure support reserve, 936,000, to enable us to, if necessary, I'm trying to still work to minimise any use of reserves in next year's budget, but to provide something as a bit of a fallback should we need it, and then to work on an efficiency programme to try and help us identify fundings to enable us to move forward with the CRMP, and also to identify any future need for savings should they be required. So if I can just take you, perhaps if I stop there for questions before we move to the recommendations. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask?
John?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Becky, and thanks, team, for all the information provided. It's amazing what a few weeks difference makes. We thought we were all right a few weeks
We
ago.
did.
But we'd sail through this. Obviously, we're not going to. But I think the key message is the old Dad's Army thing: is not to panic, and let's leave the professionals to look at it. Let's see what we can come up with before we actually start. I don't want to be ranting. Everybody's ranting the government at the moment. We'll have a rant on this side, and they'll be getting plenty of earache. But we've got to sort this out, because it does mean safety of people in Nottinghamshire. I'm just going to say, Chair, is it possible that we add to a growing tide of people, without a 3-year settlement, which we were promised? I think we should be writing for this authority to express, our disappointment of that, because it's very difficult. In your own finances, you've got to be absolutely online now, because if you don't, you'll soon go bust. There's no doubt in that. So I would ask that the authority support a letter from the chairman expressing our deep disappointment and calling for a 3-year settlement. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll pick that up, John, at the end. But any other comments or questions, John?
Just on that comment, the settlement laid yesterday is consultation, so as always we will respond to that consultation, and I think we'll reflect that disappointment of the whole sector. And as you know, I lead finance at the FCC. That is a disappointing outcome for fire. We believe it's due to the new Secretary of State for DLUC wanting to look at all of the budgets around local government, and so there's not there's still a 3-year comprehensive spending review in place. It's just the local government finances are going to be reviewed throughout this year to then give a finalised 2nd and 3rd year. But clearly that creates uncertainty for all the authorities in that. So our consultation will respond to the consultation will reflect that.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Becky?
Okay, we'll just move through to the recommendations. So the first one's to approve the medium-term financial strategy. 10.2, to approve the capital strategy and flexible use of capital receipts strategy. So the capital strategy does remain the same, it's just updated. There's no major changes from last year. Approve the reserve strategy, which contains the information on those earmarked reserves, and also the to set a minimum level of general fund reserves of £4.5 million, which is the same as last year, to provide us some security in the current uncertain climate, which is 10.4, the next recommendation. And then 10.5 is those reallocation of reserves I've set out in the table. And then 10.6 is to task the Finance and Resources Committee to provide the guidance to Fire Authority in February as respect to the options of council tax, limited to either a council tax freeze or an increase in council tax within the referendum limit, which we're expecting now to be 2% following the comprehensive spending announcement yesterday. Oh, and the final one is to ask Finance and Resources Committee the options for addressing any budget deficit to enable the Fire Authority to approve a balanced budget as required by law. So that might include some use of reserves, but as I said, we're still working very closely with John and the finance team to try and minimise those use of reserves, or hopefully not have to use them at all.
Thank you, Becky.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions for Becky? I just want to say thank you, Becky, to you and the team, and to colleagues in the principal office team, and particularly John, to you in the your colleagues on the committee and to Toby, who's been involved in the conversations, and to group leaders, because I think where we've ended up in terms of suggested way forward in terms of the medium-term financial strategy is a, as you said, John, calm, considered, sensible and balanced approach, given the incredibly strong headwinds that are facing us. There's issues around pay, issues around pension, issues around clear inflationary pressures that everybody can see in their own household in terms of fuel prices going up, energy prices going up, other pressures that we face. There's obviously a transition here from this current building to the new headquarters. There's the COVID issues and the pressures that bring. And I think in light of the incredibly difficult headwinds, Becky, you've landed us in a sensible, balanced position going forward. And as you said, there's now some time and room post the finance settlement yesterday to reflect, to calmly try and pull down as much as we can in the budget so that we're not drawing too heavily on reserves next year, to give us that breathing space, and to come forward with a budget in the early new year once those further conversations have taken place. I think the point you make, John, is absolutely right. It's a missed opportunity in terms of the 3-year settlement, and we'll make sure that's reflected in the consultation. But I'm also happy to write to the Secretary of State to reflect our frustration about that as well, because I think anybody would say, wherever you come at in the debate around these issues about local government finance and finance for the fire sector, planning from year to year, when you're facing the sorts of issues we've faced in terms of the inflationary pressures in the economy and the twin issue around COVID, planning from year to year is just absolutely bonkers, and not giving that foresight and that length of planning I think is a real missed opportunity. But particular thanks, Becky, to you and your colleagues, and to John and colleagues on the Finance and Resources Committee and to group leaders. I think this is a sensible, measured approach that Becky's set out that we should all be able to get behind. So I'll move the recommendations. Thank you, Roger, seconded by Councillor Jackson. All those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? Thank you very much, colleagues. That was agreed unanimously. Thank you, Becky, for the presentation of the report. Item 6 then is our Treasury Management Mid-Year Review 2021 22, in cognizance of the point that Councillor Hollis made before Becky introduced us at our last meeting. And of course, I think Becky will draw attention to the fact that there are reflections taking place on the point you raised, Councillor Hollis, about ethical standards in terms of our Treasury Management. And of course, the Treasury Management strategy, which we approve, will come early in the new year alongside some of those issues I just talked about in terms of the budget. So please be assured, Councillor Hollis, that the point you made is being proactively considered and was subject to a conversation only a few weeks ago. But I'm sure Becky will touch on that in talking about the report. Becky.
Thank you. I wasn't going to dwell on this one too much, since the report is for noting, and that we are within all the criteria that we've set ourselves in the Treasury Management strategy. We do report here from mid-term and the end of year update on our Treasury Management activity. So economic update, you'll also be aware from yesterday the Monetary Policy Committee did meet, and they voted 8-1 on an increase in interest rates to 2.25%. That doesn't actually impact on our borrowing too much or at all, because it's all fixed rate borrowing, so that's good. But it will help us probably shore up some of our interest on our investments a little bit, which has been fairly woeful over the last year or two. In response, when the rates were fairly low, we have borrowed £2 million since we last reported to you back in October from Public Works Loan Board towards financing the capital programme. So that's in line with what we were expecting, and we will keep monitoring that. We try not to borrow too much in advance. It's always a bit of a balancing act between getting a good rate and borrowing before we need it, because we can't usually borrowing costs for around 2%, but we can only invest it for a very, very small amount, 0.2%. So it's a cost of carry there if we do borrow before we need it. With investments, as you just alluded to, Chair, the investments are made within the current Treasury Management strategy that we hold. We currently hold £13.5 million of investments that all held with banking institutions at the moment, and we are currently looking at our capital strategy. I've done that one. We're currently looking at the Treasury Management strategy with a view to looking at ways of building in those ethical standards that we did discuss at the last meeting. So unless anybody's got any questions, on 2.23 you'll see the prudential limits that we set and that all our activity is within those limits. If anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Are we limited to where we can invest our investments?
Yes, we have a very strict lending criteria. We're a very risk-averse organisation, and we do work. We have some Treasury Management consultants called Link Asset Management, and they watch the markets and they grade all counterparties, and then from that grading, they give them different colour gradings, and within that we invest either short term or up to 1 year. We have no investments at the moment over 1 year. We do have the ability to do it for a small amount. I think it's for £2 million. We do say in the strategy that we could invest, but in reality we don't hold a significant amount of investments. 13 million is like a quarter of our activity, and it does back those reserves generally. So should they be needed, we don't want anything out too long where we wouldn't be able to pull the money back, especially in interest rates are so short. To invest long term when interest rates might go up, that would probably not be a wise thing to do. So yes, we do, and we're continually monitoring that, and before we make any investments we always check against that counterparty list and those limits set out in the Treasury Management strategy.
It's just disappointing that the reserve is very poor on that and the effort. Way too number.
Yes. But it does reflect the security of the investments that flow, and we'll all be aware of the Icelandic banks, the banks where local authorities have lost money, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So it's unfortunate, but it's better than losing the investments.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks, Becky. Any other comments or questions? We're asked to note the contents of the report. Colleagues happy to note them? Agreed. Thank you. Item 7, National Scheme for Auditor Appointments. Becky?
Thank you. Save the more interesting ones last. So you'll be aware that we have Ernst & Young as our auditors at the moment. They're on a 5-year contract which is due to run till the end of 22-23 accounts. From then on, we need to run a procurement exercise to appoint auditors. We'll be looking at the following 5 years. We have 3 options to do that. We can either appoint our own auditors, but in order to do that, it does entail quite a significant amount of work, in that we have to set up an independent auditor panel to make the standalone appointment. It has to be carefully monitored and managed by that audit panel. That has to be held by independent members. We could work jointly with other authorities to jointly procure an auditor, or we can opt into the national auditor scheme, the appointment scheme, which is run by public sector audit appointments, PSAA. Now, you'll all be familiar with the issues that we've had with our external auditors in the last 2 or 3 years. But to be fair, that although it's been very difficult to manage the contracts, a lot of the problems behind that are falling towards the lack of audit, the changes in the audit market, changes in audit regulations, and a lack of staff with an ability to undertake, particularly local government auditors, that audit. There are only 9 audit firms that are able to undertake public sector auditors or audits, so it is a very limited pool that we're looking towards. My concern is that if we were to try to appoint some independently, with being such a relatively small organisation, we would completely fail to appoint any auditors at all, which would put us in a very difficult position. So my recommendation is that we join the national procurement scheme with PSAA, which should provide. It was quite interesting actually. I was clearing out my office a couple of weeks ago, ready for the move to the new joint headquarters, and I found an old audit contract that we had back in 2009-10, and the cost was over £70,000 for the audit. And this public procurement that we do with PSAA has brought those costs back down, right down to we're only being paying 24,000. And I know we've got additional costs, but even with those additional costs, it's still below what we were paying back in 2009-10. So it does demonstrate that despite the weaknesses and the problems that we have had with PSAA and the audits that we've had, I think there are still benefits to be had with moving with the national scheme. So that's the recommendation on the report, is to accept public sector audit appointments invitation to opt into the sector-led option for the appointment of external auditors from 5 years from 1st of April 2023.
Thank you, Becky. Any comments or questions? John?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Becky. Fully support the recommendation there, because it's been a bit of a roller coaster over the last few years, and it's significant. I think it's been embarrassing for the government. Also very difficult to maintain some sort of balance for all this a local authority. So I'd fully recommend that we go into the public sector appointments and join along. I think most of the LGA are now heading that way, most of the local authorities, so I think we should do that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any other?
Fully support that, Chair.
Thank you, Roger. So I'll move the recommendation. It's been seconded by Councillor Jackson. People happy to approve?
Agreed.
Yeah. It's agreed unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay, item 8 on our agenda is Principal Officer Pay Review. So Chief Fire Officer and Assistant Chief Fire Officer just going to leave. Declared an interest. And Clerk to the Authority, Malcolm Townley, is just going to take us through this report, which I think is self-explanatory, but Malcolm will just pull out the salient issues for us.
Thank you, Chair. So what we have in place is a mechanism whereby we review the Principal Officer pay, and Principal Officer pay starts with the Chief Fire Officer. We benchmark it against a number of similar local authorities, which we call the family group, of 18 other authorities, which you will see in the report are set out in Appendix B. The review takes place every 2 years, so the last time the authority would have seen this would have been in 2019. The current review has indicated that the Principal Officer pay is at the right rate when compared to the family group, and in those circumstances what we are recommending is that there should be no change in the rate of Principal Officer pay. But I'm happy to answer any questions if you have.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Any comments or questions on this particular paper? No, I'm not saying any. I'll move the recommendation, which is that the Fire Authority agrees the continuation of the current level of pay for the principal officers from the 1st of January 2022. Somebody happy to second? Councillor Jackson seconded. All those in favour? Agreed. All those against? Any abstentions? Thank you very much, colleagues. That's carried unanimously. Okay, our next item on the agenda is item 9, Chief Fire Officer appointment. This is a report from the Appointments Committee, of which I chaired as the Chair of the Fire Authority. Thank you to colleagues who sat on the panel to interview and appoint the new Chief Fire Officer. The report, again, is self-explanatory, but as colleagues will be aware, for transparency purposes, the current Chief Fire Officer, John Buckley, to my right, retires on the 15th of April 2022, to be precise, and I think I've said before in this meeting will be sorely missed, and a massive thank you, John, to the leadership you've shown while you've been here, but particularly throughout COVID. It's been exemplary, and I think it was appropriate that it was recognised at the awards ceremony a few short weeks ago. The process that was gone through, as you would expect, was a robust process. As the report sets out, it involved application, personal statement, written and paper presentation, some psychometric profiling, a strategic operational exercise, which was interesting. I think it talked about a particular incident with a fire not too far from a hospital where smoke had impact on the hospital and potential runoff of contaminant into nearby water, and quite interesting actually the individual applicants taking part in that and being observed by people who have got expertise in gold command, I think as it is, and how you strategically lead in an incident like that. Obviously we were advised as an elected member panel throughout by the Chief Fire Officer, as was agreed by the authority, and we had colleagues from HR there, as well as obviously the clerk, and colleagues from the consultants that we used. There was a really rigorous process. We had 2 candidates, 1 external candidate, 1 internal candidate. The authority, obviously you as elected members, had agreed that we were going to place an advert through a range of different places, particularly using channels like the National Fire Chiefs Council, that we were going to take on somebody from within the Fire and Rescue Service with the professional competence to be appointed as Chief Fire Officer. And I'm pleased to say that following the process that was gone through and the interview that we then conducted as a cross-party panel, that the panel came to a unanimous decision that the current Deputy Chief Fire Officer, Craig Parkin, should be offered the post of Chief Fire Officer, subject to the approval of the authority here today, obviously, which is the decision-making body. I'll just reflect on that in a moment in terms of Craig, but just wanted to also draw attention, which is referenced in the recommendations here, that obviously if that appointment is approved today in terms of the first recommendation, it will create a vacancy in terms of the Deputy Chief Fire Officer post that Craig currently holds, and you will see in the report arrangements are set out in terms of what will happen in the immediacy. Clearly we can't leave ourselves with capacity and without that leadership, but at the same time clearly Craig is an incoming Chief Fire Officer, particularly as well given some of the conversations we've just been having about future challenges facing the authority, will want to reflect in time about what the sort of team he needs around him as Chief Fire Officer, in the same way that John has done. So what we're also recommending here, as you will see, is an arrangement to put in place operational and managerial support at Assistant Chief Fire Officer level in the immediate term. This will require seeking expressions of interest from internal competent area managers, with any prospective candidates being considered by the Appointments Committee, that same group that made the decision around the Chief Fire Officer, and then final approval coming here to Fire Authority in February 2022. The final point, which is referred to in 2.7 and 2.8 of the report, is just in case people have got questions in the back of their mind, which is a conversation we've had as elected members about how will arrangements work in terms of deputisation for the Chief Fire Officer, and that is set out very clearly there, that if the Chief Fire Officer needs to and is absent, then they will appoint the Deputy Chief Fire Officer, which you would expect. In the unlikely event the Chief Fire Officer is, for whatever reason, unexpectedly incapacitated, and let's hope that doesn't happen, but we do have to plan for those eventualities, we would use the emergency provisions within the standing orders that the authority's got to make sure that somebody was stepping up to be that Chief Fire Officer, because that is a responsibility for us as the authority. The rest, I think, of the report is self-evident and very clear. So the recommendations are that we agree to the appointment of Craig Parkin as Chief Fire Officer with the effect from the 16th of April 2022, as recommended by the Cross-Party Appointments Committee, and that we task the Chief Fire Officer with supporting the authority in the recruitment of a temporary Assistant Chief Fire Officer, subject to the agreement of recommendation 10.1 above. And let me just say, in moving those recommendations, that Craig gave an absolutely outstanding account of himself on the day. Both candidates were very strong candidates with experience of being of leading. Craig has certainly stood up for John on occasion and led for us on a number of partnership arrangements. He gave a really good account of himself on the day. I was fortunate enough to be the chair of the HR committee, I think, in my early years on the Fire Authority, where Craig was my principal support officer, I think then as an Assistant Chief Fire Officer. And I have to say, and you won't mind me saying this, he has grown massively since being Assistant Chief Fire Officer, then Deputy Chief Fire Officer, and now obviously preparing to step up in his role as Chief Fire Officer, a bit like John, he's a man of deep integrity. He really, really cares about the city and the county. Of course, he cares about every single member of staff that works here and takes a keen interest, and he's acutely aware of the pressures in our own local communities and how he can support us as elected members. But in conversations with Craig and working closely with Craig, and I think John would attest to this, he really, really cares about the communities here in the city and county as well, in the same way that John does. And he's got stuck in other pieces of work and other partnership arrangements that go above and beyond the day work that you would expect of him as a Deputy Chief Fire Officer. So I'm certainly looking forward to working with him as the incoming Chief Fire Officer. John will clearly be a very hard act to follow, but Craig is a different person and we face different challenges, and it is about looking forwards now to the future in the spring, and I know Craig's going to do a fantastic job for us. So subject to the approval of the recommendations, if you are listening, Craig, I know he's sent his apologies today. Unfortunately, COVID has got him. So wishing you well and a speedy recovery, Craig. And if you are listening, subject to the approval in a moment of the recommendations, huge congratulations on behalf of the authority. So I'm going to formally move the recommendations. Somebody happy to second the recommendations? Councillor Jackson seconding the recommendations. All those in favour? Any against? Any abstentions?
Could I just comment, Chair?
Of course, yes.
Congratulations to Craig on obtaining this post. I just found it very disappointing when you had two applications for a very, high-powered, prestigious, an important position within this county. And I just don't know whether that's normal in the firefighting these days. I would have thought there are more people out there wanting to step up to the mark to the firefighting. But that's just a comment I made actually.
John?
Yeah, I can respond to that. I think, when I raised that I was retiring, I think I mentioned that it is very common actually for only one applicant to apply, unfortunately. Some of that is significant turnover in the sector over the last few years. I am one of the longest standing chiefs now in the country, but if you go back just 5 years, about 85% of the chiefs have turned over, so there's been quite a lot of turnover. There's a lot of uncertainty about the personal pension implications for IN individuals in the public sector. I think that brings a lot of concern to individuals as well. And I think the other thing I would also add is the job's a tough one, and individuals think twice before taking it on as well, I think. So there's a whole combination there. What I will say is that the NFCC is working hard around progressive development for staff within the sector, and are also putting together a direct entry scheme to support organisations like ourselves who took Candida in. We did that through the development of our own process, and we're working with Home Office to establish a nationally agreed process around direct entry to try and create greater opportunity at senior levels within the sector. But it is certainly a concern that many share.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Councillor Jackson. So the next item on the agenda is item 10, which is the interim report of the Independent Remuneration Panel, and the clerk is going to introduce this report. Let me just say from the outset, thank you for the forbearance of members. It is a short report. It is absolutely not like the clerk to land us with table reports, and let me just say as Chair of the Authority, that is through no fault of Mr Townrow at all. Obviously he's working with colleagues who are one step removed, if you like, independent from the service, who are volunteers in essence, who have got other commitments. But I do know that we've lost, and the clerk will reference this, we've lost one member of the Independent Remuneration Panel for personal reasons, and I do know one of them has been quite seriously ill at a couple of points actually in trying to have conversations. So I just want to make it clear before Malcolm introduces the report that it's not like the clerk to table the report. Thank you for members' forbearance in terms of it being tabled here today, but I know Malcolm will walk us through it, and hopefully it's a self-evident and straightforward report.
Thank you for that, Chair, and yes indeed, and thank you actually to the two remaining members of the Independent Remuneration Panel for meeting with me in difficult circumstances. We haven't been able to meet collectively. A lot of it has been done with the Chair and remotely by phone conversation, or at times through failing technology through Teams or Zoom meetings. But the intention is to bring in a third member of the panel and to look at the the existing member scheme further in the new year, but in the meantime, as an interim measure, the two remaining members of the panel recognise the importance of dealing with two issues. The first is the continuation of the existing inflator, which has been in place for 4 years, and the second is the recognition of the amount of work undertaken through the group meetings during the COVID pandemic, and recognise the importance of a further additional remuneration to group leaders. So at the moment it is limited to groups of 4 or more. It's recognised that that should be extended to groups of 2 or more, which actually fits in with national legislation and recognition of group size, which is indeed 2 or more. So the two recommendations before you today are continuation of the inflator, that already exists, but it needs to be renewed, and secondly is the change from payments to groups leaders of 4 or more to groups of 2 or more, but they are the recommendations of the independent remuneration panel members.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, and thank you. I'll echo your points to, particularly given the personal circumstances for the members of the independent remuneration panel for the work that they've done as well in bringing this report forward. Any comments or questions people want to raise? I'm going to move the recommendation. Somebody happy to second the two recommendations before us, which Malcolm's read out? Yeah. All those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you, Malcolm, and thanks to the independent remuneration panel, and of course look forward to any further deliberations in the new year referencing the report from the panel. Item 11 then is committee outcomes, which are on page 105 to 128 in our pack. Any comments or questions in relation to any of the committee outcomes? Going to move those then. People are happy to, I think we're just here to note them, not agree them. People happy to note them? Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Okay, item 12 then is exclusion of the public. So it is to consider excluding the public from the meeting during the consideration of the following item in accordance with section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972 under Schedule 12A Part 1, paragraphs 1 and 3, on the basis that, having regard to all circumstances, the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. I'm going to move that. Somebody happy to second? We agreed to go into closed session? Agreed.